fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and welcome to Architecture Talk. Here in the United States, it's Thanksgiving week and we are celebrating this holiday, and we don't have a new episode for you this week, but we are reissuing one of the best episodes from the recent past, my conversation with Shima Mohajeri on the work of Tange and Kahn in Tehran. I hope you enjoy it, and for those of you in the United States, happy Thanksgiving. Hello Shima, welcome to Architecture Talk.
Hello Vikram, thanks for having me.
I'm looking at your book here, which has just been published by Routledge Research in Architecture.
Yep.
A beautiful book called The Architectures of Transversality.
Yes.
I like that title. And the subtitle is Paul Klee, Louis Kahn, and the Persian Imagination.
Yes.
And from the back of the book and your chapters, it seems like one of the things, what you are trying to do is to articulate, I think I read it somewhere in your book, the present project's untimely turn to modernity by no means characterizes an uncritical fascination with the Western project of the Enlightenment and its ideals of progress.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not simply a fascination with the great march of progress of Western Enlightenment. Rather, it proposes to return not to modernity's mainstreams, but to its hidden currents and estuaries. Hidden currents and estuaries, in order to find a fresh start. Yet, this late transgression and return towards modernity does not indicate a flight from the local realities and practices of modernity in Iran. So it's not an escape route, it's not an escape hatch.
Yes.
If only we had this, wouldn't that be magical?
Mm-hmm.
Correct?
Yes.
That's not what you're arguing. It's not utopian in its scope.
No, not at all.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. The question that presses itself upon Iranians today is how to transform their vestigial and unfinished project of modernization into a genuine experience that seizes modernity in the process of becoming, before it is hastily spatialized and historicized into empty and inverted forms. Okay, so this is very intriguing to me, and I'm intrigued by this because obviously I feel there is a sort of an equivalent situation in South Asia and India,
Mm-hmm.
particularly its intersection with the modernity through the Nehruvian period and through the work that I have done with Corbusier and the making of Chandigarh, which can be read either as like the Shah's projects of modernization, can be read as a Nehruvian state, nation state, utopian, Western Enlightenment dedicated project of modernity, and a failed project of modernity in that sense.
Right.
Because it never took the people into account and never sort of integrated and inscribed and wrote a sort of local public social agency into the project. Or potentially, if one wanted, one could read Corbusier, Chandigarh, modernity, because Chandigarh's aesthetic modernity as a site where consciously or unconsciously a kind of aesthetic space is made palpable, if not explicit,
Mm-hmm.
by a certain Corbusian reading of India, which foreshadows or sort of opens the path towards another modernity to come.
Yes.
And I'm asking you, I mean, is that what is this future that you see and think is possible via architecture in the Iran to come?
Yeah, so by emphasizing and introducing this notion of transversality, I wanted to find a sort of invisible approach, an invisible tool to not only critique that kind of local, national modernities that those nativist approaches that are being adopted by many developing countries.
And even in the West.
And even in the West,
yeah.
Exactly. Nor, going to the path of universalism. So it's not about these imposing these abstract, logical, rational plans of modernist architects to a local culture. But what would happen was that these modernist architects transported their ideas of modernity to these other cultures, into the peripheries of modernity.
Yeah, exported them in sense.
Exported them,
yeah.
And as an object, and it was basically the materiality and objectivity of modernity and their principles that was exported.
Right.
And it was actually being clashed by a culture place that was being regarded as a subjectivity, as a spiritual, with the spiritual values that want to resist this object of modernity. So
it's an opposition situation.
Exactly. Yeah. So we always have this clash of local and global.
Right.
And it's not just that the local culture try to domesticate or transfigure or work with that object that has been traveled to its local context, but there are some voices of resistance.
Yeah.
So we have all these anti-Western sentiments.
Sure.
So it's always about the danger of the foreign, the danger of the unknown that is being traveled or even imposed in many cases.
Yeah, very often imposed. Yeah.
Very often imposed. So we have always this clash, and the thing that many even Western philosophers and theoreticians talk about is this incomplete project of modernity.
Right,
so even in its Western domain, it has remained incomplete because it has all these problematics of like representation, logic, democracy, developmental history.
Yeah.
They have all been, they haven't been problematized, they haven't been localized in different contexts to be able to give modernity the possibility to live, to being brought to life. So it's just.
How do you propose to do that? How do you think it should be done, or could be done, or has been done? How can it be brought to life?
Yeah, it's just a simultaneous growth of place, any cultural place, local place, and modernity.
Yeah.
And the possibility of critique and scrutinizing modernity and its principles and values.
Yeah.
At the same time, modernity being open to this kind of what I call lateral friendship with the local culture. So
lateral friendship.
Yeah, it's all these. It's not a friendship based on just simple joy and happiness. It's this friendship that has all these. Has to go through all these struggles at multiple fronts, not only existential but political and aesthetic and
it's like a marriage, isn't it?
Exactly.
Lateral. So what do you mean by lateral versus what? Like a utopian friendship or sort of a collaborative? How is lateral different from collaborative or
this latter
regionalized?
Yeah, it crosses over things. It's just. It not only try to resist, like in this case, the limitations of, if you think about nationalism, the limitations of fixed identity, racism, or even in the case of political systems, totalitarian frameworks, and hierarchical structures of power. So once this lateral movement crosses over and try to even slightly change its course, then we start to see some interesting connections and collaborations, which is now make meaningful routes. So it's not just about this clash.
Right. So does that produce new things?
Yeah, definitely.
Or
We're
does it
looking
just
for
produce halfway houses, neither here nor there?
No, we're not talking about hybrids, definitely,
Yeah.
because one thing about postmodernism that we don't like is creating these neutral, sterile, weak and boring collages and hybrid artifacts that do not invigorate, do not create life.
Do not energize, do not make modernity live.
Exactly. And it's just, it's a very weak critique of modernity. We want to critique the structures of space that does not allow us to create, to produce novel things.
So take me down, some of the ways in which invigorating lateral intersections have happened in your book. I know you're particularly looking at the cases of the paintings of Paul Klee and some of the projects of Louis Kahn in Tehran.
Right.
Tell us about your reading of these, or any other cases which you think have this transversality or laterality, invigorating laterality to it. Pick one, your favorite.
Right. My favorite is, of course, Paul Klee.
Paul Klee.
Yes. And after that, Louis Kahn.
Okay.
That's why I focus on these two figures.
Okay.
But if we think about Paul Klee, which I came across his series of miniatures by accident as I was doing my research. So
what are the miniatures? When did you do them? Tell us about it.
Going back to the early 20th century, we have these arrival of Persian miniatures in Europe in many exhibitions, specifically the Masterpieces of Mohammedan Art exhibition in Munich in 1910, this famous exhibition which brought these Oriental, Islamic, Persian artifacts to the European audience, including avant-garde artists. So we know that Paul Klee actually came into contact with these miniatures either through these exhibitions or his membership in the Blue Rider, the artistic group including Kandinsky and Franz Marc. And Klee was actually reading their documents, their exhibition reviews, and Kandinsky's book praising Persian art. And I think the main point of contact happened when he was reading Goethe's West Eastern Divan. And his poetic work, which was philosophical.
You do quote Goethe a lot in your book.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so Goethe's Divan was actually this dialogue with the Persian Sufi Hafez, his intellectual twin. And he wrote all these poetries, and Klee became fascinated by these poetic lines. And
who wrote the Goethe or the
Goethe?
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Sort of in dialogue with the Sufi poet?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, exactly.
So, but they're not contemporaries. The Sufi poet has got to be 16th century, right? Yeah. 17th.
Earlier, I think.
Even earlier.
Earlier. What happened was that he was looking at these Persian miniatures, and he knew that these miniatures were part of these book manuscripts. It was not just a framed painting in a Western tradition. And so he knew that these stories and these interesting figures and color harmonies and linear designs were in correspondence to a message, a poetic line. What he did with his own miniatures was that he read Goethe's Divan and he translated those into visual.
Fantastic. In that way, he sort of was doing the same work.
Exactly.
Complementing Goethe's poetry as the miniature paintings were.
Right.
Yeah.
And so
But those miniature paintings in that exhibition of 1910, were they in connection with the Sufi poet that Goethe was?
No, not necessarily.
Okay, but it was
we don't know exact, because there was another museum in in Berlin.
Yeah.
They had a newly established Islamic art department, and we know for sure from Klee's diaries that he stopped there and he contemplated on that in the Islamic department in the museum. So we know that he loved this small scale, these minute paintings. So he drew a number of paintings between 1916 and 1918, right at the time when he was on duty. So
on duty in the
for
war.
the Great War.
Yeah.
So many art critiques argue that Klee was completely politically and socially blind to the predicaments of the war. And he was using all these abstract forms just to withdraw from the realities of the things that were going on around him.
Right.
But what I argue, based on my readings of these miniatures, was that it was actually through his miniatures and his connection with the art of the Orient, this aesthetics of alterity, he was trying to actually resist these nationalistic and sort of chauvinistic patriarchy of the war. And through his reading of Goethe, connected to the Persian culture, seeing these miniatures and creating these very interesting miniatures.
So you're reading Klee's painting as an anti-chauvinistic, nationalistic act because it devotes itself to transnational, transcultural, multidisciplinary, diachronic translations.
Exactly. Not only because I think that was the case, but also the critiques of the time condemned Klee of femininity, foreignness. His
It's
art
not
was
masculine.
foreign. It was dangerous. It was, especially
What
during
critics?
the time
Modernist
of the war.
critics? What kind of critics?
Actually, the German art critiques during the war, they were concerned about these unpatriotic practices
so
of
these were
artists.
all considered
So
Okay.
And
so German or French? Paul Klee was where?
He was Swiss,
Swiss,
originally, and he moved to Germany. So he was working in Berlin at the time. And so looking at, if I move you through a couple of these miniatures, there are, I read these and saw these miniatures and analyzed them together with Klee's own poems.
I see.
And theoretical writings. So it was right at the time when he was painting these miniatures that he thought that he had a philosophical turn.
I see. In what direction?
All along, he was thinking of how we could spatialize the concept of time. How we could bring past and present to the space of the now. And how we could just heal this rift and tension between these two aspects of time, because the thing that we were talking about, tradition and modernity, local and global, all these tensions that we have. So it was interesting for him that these miniatures were trying to solve this whole problem. So and the way they did that is by showing the process of creation and genesis. Meaning they didn't want to just mimic the created objects being, the realism of the world. They wanted to basically go back to the sort of primordial time of beginning, the time when creation started, and they wanted to just actively participate in the process of creation rather than, just representing.
Who's they here? The miniature painters?
The miniature painters. And Klee was actually get inspired by that. So the miniatures, they do not try to dissolve time by putting this simultaneous...
like in Cubism.
Like Cubism. They actually shows this slow animation of going back and forth in time, both to the past and to the future, and bring the two into the space of the now.
Into the same frame.
In the same framework.
And Klee does the same thing in his version?
In his version, actually, it's a very complex thing
Yeah.
because he didn't want to go the Cubist route.
Yeah.
Because he believed that this cinematographic representation of different perspectives and viewpoints does not bring time to space or spatialized time, in other words. But he actually shows in one of his miniatures, for instance, he actually shows this whole process of creation, showing this simultaneous, not only formal and textual presentations, but also because he believed in not only in the formal simultaneity, but also ethical simultaneity. So for him, this moment, this beginning in time when everything was created, was basically had two powers, the masculine and feminine. So he showed these feminine and masculine forces simultaneous. So he was thinking about this Mazda'ian idea of good and evil, and their simultaneity, how they do not overwhelm each other and suffocate each other, but they coexist. And Klee wanted to, thinking of one of his miniatures called Varsala, means vicegerent of God. He depicted himself on a scale with a kingly male figure, which is the masculine God, and then a feminine figure, which is pregnant with multiplicity of letters and objects. And these letters are both in Arabic and Latin scripts. And then he placed himself on a scale, looking back at the male figure, and try to actually bring together these two feminine and masculine forces, and sort of take over this responsibility of creation and creativity, and taking it over and try to move forward and create more and more.
Okay.
So,
all right, but let's return for a moment to sort of this reading of time, because and what I'm hearing is there's a sort of critique of the Cubist production of time via faceting and fragmentation,
right.
Which was a critique of standard perspectival Renaissance appropriation of space in on a flat surface, right?
Right.
But here we have another understanding of time and its production in painting, which is not about more objectivity, which is what faceting in a sense is about, more accurate representation, non-perspectival representation, but sort of more of a simultaneity of time and kind of a destruction of time as something that's very diachronic, but exists both in its past and future in the present in a certain way. Is that the sort of direction?
Yes.
And is that the kind of energization of trans-cultural, non-hybridized thinking that you're talking about?
Yes, we are very close.
Okay.
I try to think about other paintings and bring these into our discussion. So through some of his miniatures, he wanted to show that we as human beings are kind of constrained by time, and we the movement of time is from the future. The traditional classic definition of time and its movement is this element of time coming toward us in the present from the future and fades in the past.
Right.
So what Klee was trying to do is just go back, this what he calls
the angel of history
retrograde.
painting.
Exactly.
Yes, yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. He says we as human beings are a half prisoner, half born on wings.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
We are just stuck in this tragic condition.
Yeah.
And so he wanted to go back and start from the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
the point of beginning, the kind of pre-cosmic state,
Okay.
and then create everything on his own,
Uh-huh.
and then just leap forward into the future instead of waiting for the future possibilities to come toward him. He just wanted to leap forward into
Infinite
into the
future.
infinite future, which he represented as these cosmic world, this telescopic world into the space and its celestial bodies and everything, and just to embrace his finitude and death. So it's all about
right.
these two polarities of, like he calls egg and death,
Yeah, yeah.
and wanted to bring them both into the present and to defeat time by controlling time into the present and just go the reversed
So did he succeed?
way. I think so.
Okay.
So in a couple of his miniatures, he is representing this not only the place, the beginning of time and the story of creation in Genesis, and try to solve this division between masculinity and femininity, and stand as a mediator in between these two oppositions. But also he actually shows this space of the subterranean space of the underworld, which is very silent. It's full of matter and energy, and it has this feminine sort of character, this space of the unborn.
Right.
We are not yet in the world, it's just
Yeah.
the pre-cosmic world. And in a number of other paintings, he focused on this space of futurity.
Yeah.
And again, he, by reference to the Persian poems, the Rose and the Nightingale, and the way the nightingale actually embraces his death for the love of the rose.
Right.
And the interesting thing for me is how all these are being brought into his well-known painting, The Tutoring Machine.
I see, the tutoring machine.
Right.
That's your focus painting.
Yes.
I see. And you see this as an example of an aesthetic agency in the hands of Paul Klee, of the kind of work that is not hybridized transnational modernity to be making,
Yes.
rather than utopic or sort of simple-mindedly local thinking.
Yes. If you think about tutoring machine, this is very well represented. This whole notion of transversality, and its bringing together of this tradition, this Persian tradition of the idea of this love affair between the nightingale and the rose, these feminine and masculine forces that are kind of dissolved into one piece, and then we have the machine. So in this work, Klee represented the nightingales, which are not one. So the artist is kind of multiplied here. The nightingale is a metaphor for artists and poets. So the nightingales in their collective song is actually not only become the mediator between the mechanical crank on the one side, and also this becoming mechanical of the flower, which is the rose on the right side of the picture. So they actually bring these two forces into a creative song. So the machine is tutoring and making sounds and making voices based on bringing together these dualities of the nature and the machine, the kind of historicity and futurity, machine and technological progress toward the future, and the rose as the symbol of history.
So
and
this is sort of
tradition.
like, this is a magic machine.
Yes, definitely. And he wanted to he wanted to show an auto-functioning machine.
Uh-huh.
There is no agent moving this crank. It's like we are looking at the primordial state of movement. It's like the birds, by their singing, move the crank and move and rotate the flower on its spin and its ovary.
I see.
So
the movement of the engine and the rotation, this is time or space?
it is exactly the spatial representation of time, definitely. And the artists are representation of this collective people or culture to come. So we are waiting for this novelty of not only an individual but a collective people to
It's something that's
arrive.
not even an opposition between an individual and a collective.
Exactly.
And he's describing this, not thinking just about Iran or the non-West or the developing world. This is his sort of aspiration for the world in general,
Exactly. And he's
particularly
teaching,
given the calamity of World War I.
Exactly. It's actually, the tutoring machine was painted during his teaching position at Bauhaus.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah, and there is another interesting story when, he wanted to get a teaching position at Stuttgart,
Yeah.
but he was denied the position because of his miniatures.
Uh-huh.
And he called this period the tragedy, this condition, the tragedy of the miniatures. So because he was, he unlike the other modernists like Kandinsky and others,
Yeah.
he actually wanted to keep and preserve his ornamental, decorative aspect in his paintings and his association with the non-West.
Yeah. So that was no good.
His work was called mystical,
Yeah,
unethical, foreign, and even Jewish.
Yeah.
So he was denied the position in the early 20s, and he went on a journey of covering up his Persian sources and Oriental sources, and this whole act of redressal was gave him the position at Bauhaus a few years later.
Wow.
But he kept this ornamental style and sort of invisible in his work.
So the scapegoating of the Oriental, or sort of the non-Western, or the desire for the other, as a necessary precondition to enter into the mythical unification of the Bauhausian mythology.
Exactly. But this painting was painted in Bauhaus. You see, the tutoring machine, he kept all these miniature related concepts and just created something. And many people says this is the critique of the age of machine and its artificially reproduced products.
Yeah.
But I don't see this as an opposition between the tradition and the organicism and toward against modernity.
Yeah.
This is he was trying actually to bring these two forces together to create a new culture, a new worldview, a different worldview.
So do you think this kind of work has such a culture come into being anywhere in the world?
Yeah, why not? Yeah.
Does it exist anywhere? Or is there a sort of a class of aesthetic objects or artistic practices or architectural practices where Klee's aspiration, or is this sort of a latent aspiration in a lot of work, do you think?
Yeah, it could be that. That's why I'm very interested to look for other cases to see how these invisible aspects and latent aspects is working in different projects, which has an interesting hidden story.
Yeah.
But I believe, as I see in the work of Louis Kahn, this project is not just about architecture. He's thinking about the realities of social and political situation in Iran.
Yeah.
And you know, and he was trying to create a sort of public space which allows people to express their individuality, but at the same time, you know, relating to you know, the contemporary situation, whatever it is. It's a marketplace, it's the political, governmental buildings, or any other sort of institutions in the city. So going back to your question, I think, you know, as architects and artists, we can at least even slightly change the course of these diseases that we
Yes.
have in
Yeah.
our contemporary world.
Yeah.
And if we can, as I will talk later perhaps in terms of Kahn, we can we can change this course by introducing a different organization of a space, and that a space can affect people's life, you know, how they interact in a city and how they see themselves, how can they express their desires, find their talents, you know, and you know, move about in a city. So it's not a small thing that has a hidden aspect. So what I like about this concept of transversality is that although it is invisible and in a sense unfinished, but it is constantly in the state of resisting and conquering and making. It can insert itself at any time into reality,
Yeah.
and not staying in a utopian mode.
Fantastic.
And yeah, so it doesn't just
So talk to
hidden
us
in
about.
the archive.
So no, maybe even in the archive, yeah.
Yeah.
It can insert itself. So tell us. So talk to us about its agency and activation in Kahn's work.
Yeah. So when I was looking at Klee's work, I knew that he is kind of telling me many ideas, giving me many ideas about what transversality is. It can show me, but what if we think about practicing transversality,
Yeah.
you know, in the real space, as we call it.
Yeah.
So there is a kind of interesting moment in the history of modernism in Iran in the 70s,
Yeah.
when many architects, international architects, were invited to come and design buildings and design urban proposals. So Louis Kahn was one of the earliest one who was invited to Iran.
How was he invited? Why was he first invited?
He participated in a Congress, International Congress of Architects in Isfahan in 1970. And an Iranian local architect, Nader Erdogan, knew him, and he invited him to the Congress. And then 3 years later, Erdogan invited him to come and participate in this large urban projects through his acquaintance with the Queen.
Right,
so
right, okay.
he was directly invited by the Shah and the Queen, together with Kenzo Tange. So it was a collaborative project.
Yeah.
And so he came in the winter of 1973, and he and Tange visited the site, and they actually came back to their offices in Philadelphia and Tokyo and individually drew their plans.
Right.
And then they convened once more in Tehran in just about 3 weeks before Kahn's death. And they discussed their aspects of collaboration. They show each other's the plans, and Kahn actually drew the final sketch. And when he returned, actually during another trip from, I think, Bangladesh.
I mean, one of the things I want to note here is Tange was also working in Nigeria, right? And I know there were Indian modernists working in Tehran at that same time, including B.P. Mathur. So there is also this sort of network of architects from Japan, India, Sri Lanka, Africa, Iran, also Iraq,
Exactly.
that were sort of circulating in dialogue with people like Kahn and Dage, yes.
Right. Yeah, it was a very short encounter with the Iranian context. During his conversation, perhaps with the Shah and the Queen, he realized this duality and division between centers of power in Iran at the time.
Yeah.
So we have the Shah on the one side, with its progressive plan for modernizing the country, its social, political, and sort of disciplinary ideologies for modernity and modernization project. We had the White Revolution at the time, which was this as part of the international development plan for Iran and for other countries. This project of the city center in Abbasabad city center was basically a political campaign, part of the political campaign for the Shah in order to erase the memory of his return after the 1953 U.S.-assisted coup d'etat. So he, and urban projects was important for not only him but also his father before him. And so he was supervising all these plans and were participating in all these discussions between the municipality, Tehran municipality, the housing department, and ministry, everything. So he was.
The Shah was.
Yes, he was there all the time.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, we have his queen forming a second court. Which basically, you think she was forming a sort of oppositional force against the king's sort of a progressive modernity, because he was interested in culture. He was into this project of collecting and assembling art objects for different museums. She was sponsoring the famous Shiraz Art Festival, and basically she was very much interested in the preservation projects in all over the country. So we see these two modernizing forces, one interested in culture, the other in socio-political aspects of modernity, and he was sort of a technocrat. And so and Kahn realized this division from his conversations, and he saw the comprehensive plan for Tehran in the Congress, in the International Congress in Isfahan, and he actually knew that what Shah was trying to convey was not really a democratic urban space for the people of Iran, and at the same time he was his ideas were actually in contrast with the culturalist, because he was not interested in preserving the history and tradition without giving a new voice, a new form to it. So in his work, he actually dedicated individual areas and fields to the centers of power and culture. And so we have museums and national archives and libraries on top of the plan, embracing the topography. And we come down to another platform, which we have the mosque and the theater and the opera house, which we call the religious art. And then coming down on a third platform, we have a square in Maidan like the Naqsh Jahan Square in Isfahan. And he actually sent Erdogan, the Iranian architect, to Egypt, to the Valley of Kings and Queens, to see the tomb temples, the Queen Hatshepsut and Deir al-Bahari. And so Erdogan told me this story, and he said, when I was there, Louis Kahn died. And I never knew why I have been sent to Egypt. So as I was
Interesting.
looking at the archive and thinking about this project, I saw that he was actually superimposing this tripartite layers from private to public, from silent spaces to light and more public spaces, superimposed this onto the Maidan in Isfahan.
I see.
And so the cultural center becomes this tripartite layers. As you move from the more silent spaces of the archives and the museum into the second courtyard, your kind of urban participation increases until you are in the last large square and forum. The next part is actually the center for power, these governmental buildings and the marketplace, everything related to business, and the banks, and also an important station, a metro station, and parking garages, etc. So in his earlier diagrams, we see that he was actually putting the center of culture, center of power, and the city hall on a triangular configuration.
Like in America, sort of the three wings of power, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then we have this space of public in the middle.
Yeah, yeah.
The final sketch just opens up.
Yeah.
Put the center of culture on top, the center of power below, and we have the space of the public in the middle as a threshold. But what was very interesting to me was just putting the institution of the city hall on the thresholds between the center of power and the public forum.
So the central space becomes the active space of kind of where the other two percolate.
Right.
It functions kind of like a palimpsest, is what I'm reading.
Right.
A bit more, rather than a kind of a ideally distributed space in a more Hannah Arendt sense. This is more of like a palimpsestic space which produces a simultaneity of all the three. Yes?
Yes. And he actually wanted the space of the public be a space that people participate after they had their own contemplation spaces in the nooks and crannies of the museums and the mosque and the theater and opera house. So those spaces are spaces that allows people to express.
Yeah.
In this, after they're done, their own individual contemplation and musings, then they're ready to play in the space of the public, and the space of exchange and interaction and resistance and tensions, and which is the space that the real space of creativity. And they are in connection with the space of the praxis through the democratic institution of the city hall. So what is interesting, in contrast to his plan for Dhaka, he was thinking about this, the triangular of culture, people, and power, but he put the lake in the middle instead of the space of the public. But in Tehran, he actually, this idea was evolved into the real actual space that allows people to interact and show their collectivity.
That's fantastic.
And creativity.
That's fantastic. That's very interesting. Well, Shima, thank you for coming and educating me about Paul Klee and Louis Kahn, and more importantly, about the spaces, the possibilities, and the agencies of transversality.
Thank you very much.
This has been fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vikram. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is Vikram Prakash, your host, and our producer is the one and only Sammy Prouty, a graduate student of architecture here at the University of Washington in Seattle. I hope you all enjoyed our conversation, and if you did, please do take a moment to subscribe and to rate us on iTunes. See you next time. Take care. Goodbye.